You're listening to episode 281 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Gerti Schoen joins us to speak about violation of trust that occurs in our sanghas from her book, Buddha Betrayed, When Spiritual Relationships Go Awry. Hi everyone. I want to thank you for supporting the Secular Buddhist Association with your generous contributions. Because of that dana, we're able to continue offering this podcast, discussions on our website, secularbuddhism.org, and of course, our live online practice circle. And if you haven't yet, you're welcome to visit the website and show your appreciation, as we appreciate you listening in and sharing your own voice in this exploration of the Dhamma in our lives. It seems this ongoing cycle of suffering is endless. Unfortunately, I'm not talking about the kind of self-inflicted suffering of greed, hatred, and delusion, but rather the suffering imposed on others through the violation of trust and authority figures. Within Buddhism, it seems there's always a new and not at all surprising story of abuse and sexual misconduct by awake and realized teachers. What I find most surprising is that when the facts are brought to light about years of ongoing betrayal, there are still those followers who refuse to acknowledge their beloved teacher is also human and knowingly hurt others in their care. When will the cognitive dissonance become too loud to ignore? Gerti Schoen is a psychoanalyst and couple counselor in private practice in New York City and New Jersey. She has gone through 10 years of Zen training at various Buddhist centers in the U.S. and her native country, Germany, where she initially worked as a professional print and radio journalist. She came to the U.S. in 1998 and became a psychotherapist. She is also the author of The Gentle Self, a self-help book about depression and anxiety, and a blog of the same name at psychcentral.com. So sit back, relax, and have a nice mint tea. Our guest today is Gerti Schoen. Gerti, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So glad to be speaking with you about this topic. It's one that we haven't really examined for a while on this podcast. And when I saw that you'd written a book about this, which for folks listening is linked on the episode page for this episode, I thought it might be nice for us to chat about it a bit. So maybe we can start by having you tell us a bit about your background in Zen and as a psychoanalyst.
Yes, I am a licensed psychotherapist. I work in New York City and outside of New York City and New Jersey in private practice. This is my second career. I used to be a journalist, and I came here from Germany 20 years ago, and then for some reason decided to become a therapist. And that's when I entered the spiritual world and first started with Zen practice and was heavily involved in that. And then also joined other sanghas. I did some learning and Tibetan Buddhism, Korean Buddhism, mindfulness, so the whole span of Buddhist practice.
I'm curious, in this broad spectrum of training that you've had, was there anything that particularly resonated with you that was a little bit more closer that you were inclined to, whether it be Zen or Tibetan or something else? What really called to you most over the years?
It was really an ongoing development. Zen was very alien to me in the beginning because of all the rituals and the chanting, and that was very strange to me coming from a very secular world. But as one enters deeper into the community, you open up to different colors and different shades of the practice. And right now I'm actually not involved with Buddhism anymore at all. I do my own private mindfulness meditation, but I've moved more towards shamanism and these kinds of practices. So it's, for me, it's really an ongoing development that I'm so fascinated by so many spiritual practices that it's hard to say this is where I belong, because they all have so much to offer.
Yeah, I'm sure many listeners, and certainly I do, have that same sense that it's difficult to find some one thing that answers all of my needs in the same way that I don't really find one kind of sandwich that answers all of my
That's
nutrition
right.
needs either. So let's unpack a little bit the topic. You wrote the book Buddha Betrayed, When Spiritual Relationships Go Awry. And I'm wondering what made you decide to write this book. Were there some events that led up to it, or what was it that made you write this?
Yeah, when I wrote the book, it came out of a falling out I had with a Sangha that I had been involved with for a long time. And it was kind of my own personal processing of the events, and writing is such a great tool to do that. And through the processing of it, so many lights went on and so many doors opened. It was really a very therapeutic thing to do.
So let's talk about the book itself. Did you do some research about this? Was there anything that surprised you or otherwise stood out?
Yeah, I think the most surprising thing came kind of in the process of researching it. I started the book because I was very hurt and disappointed by leaving the Sangha I was involved with. I was, like I assume many other spiritual beginners, heavily invested in the relationship with the teacher and also the Sangha, the members of the community. And because I entered the community at a very fragile time, I had made this transition from journalism to psychotherapy, and it was kind of a time where everything broke open, all my whole identity, my whole knowledge of what is this all about, what am I about, all the self-examination that went with the process made me very fragile and vulnerable, and very much in need of guidance and input and spiritual relationships. So especially in the beginning, I built up this whole construct in my head of what a spiritual teacher was supposed to
Mm.
be. And that is maybe the most important term in this whole occurrence is the concept of idealizing, that we start to idealize the teachers and who they're supposed to be and all their enlightened being that there is, and they're supposed to have all the answers and all their life together. And of course that's not the case, that most teachers only show that quote unquote enlightened side to their students, and they don't feel free to disclose that they too have problems and they have difficult relationships and they suffer from illnesses and all these things. So when teachers don't feel comfortable sharing their whole being with students, it's very easy to build up this fantasy of the perfect spiritual teacher. And then when that doesn't pan out, as it never does, of course the fall is very deep and very painful. And if there aren't slow warning signs or slow phasing in of, okay, we're all just humans here, you kind of go from, oh yeah, this person is perfect, to, oh wait, it's just another Joe, right,
Yeah.
who happens to be a teacher, and that can be very painful. But it's also extremely important for the student, because that's what we as students have to go through to grow up and to become really mature and to become spiritual, mature people ourselves.
I'm curious about the response in your own break with the Sangha and the events that led to you making that separation. Were the other members of the Sangha also a bit challenged, some of them, by what they knew transpired, or was there just defense of the teacher because they were still in that space of idolizing them as an enlightened being? What was that like? Was it a mixed bag or what?
It was a little bit mixed bag. There were a few other people who broke away at the same time. Most people stayed, some completely enmeshed with the teacher, others kind of struggling with their own process but still staying, others staying because they wanted, they wanted to be teachers themselves and wanted the affiliation. I read a quote once that went something like, mature teacher, mature Sangha, immature teacher, immature Sangha. So at the time, it was mostly an immature Sangha, but with some older and more seasoned students.
And I imagine one of the biggest challenges in having that kind of separation, that kind of disappointment in seeing a teacher as a human being, and a flawed one, perhaps in some ways quite deeply, that along with that disappointment must also come some questioning about the teaching, that they have embodied this, they're the representative, and that with that may come a deep questioning and doubt about Buddhism, about Zen in this case. What was that like for you? Did you notice that happening as well?
Not immediately. For a while, I kept on searching. Like I entered other Buddhist sanghas, and even, the secular Buddhism. It was a concept that was very appealing to me. But when I encountered similar situations over and over and over, I realized that it all comes back to me, right? At the end of the day, it always comes back to yourself. And you have to examine your own problems and your own pitfalls that got you in it. And I guess one of my pitfalls, why I was so deeply entrenched with Buddhism, was this premise of getting rid of self, right? Oh, if I could only get rid of self, or ego rather, then I can be happy. And sort of that denial of human existence to some degree, human meaning imperfect and struggling, maybe was very much entrenched in my own beliefs about myself. And only when I kind of came out of that, I started looking at other spiritual concepts, and everything became more balanced. Mm-hmm. So now, you're right. Now I am not a Buddhist anymore. And now I am, I don't know, maybe making up my own spirituality from all the things that I've learned about, and not really making it about any teachers or teachings, but really what works for myself. And a part of the process is that admission of we're all humans, and as long as we have a body, we will be imperfect, and there is no perfection. And, in psychotherapy, there is this concept, the Jungian concept of the shadow, that we have to embrace our negative sides, the things that we don't like about ourselves. And that's one of the things that tends to get completely split off and denied in the Buddhist world. So as long as we don't deal with that, there's always going to be disappointments and idealizing and falling out.
Gerti, I wonder about your thoughts on if there are some common risk factors for this kind of abuse to occur, say within a Zen context. I know this is something that we've discussed on this podcast before, but I'm interested in hearing some of your thoughts about what some of the common streams are in what ends up happening in these abuse situations?
Well, most of the time it's simply people going through crisis. I mean, the students, first and foremost, most people enter a Sangha when they are in crisis and are particularly fragile and vulnerable, especially in the beginning. And then, of course, teachers. Whenever a teacher goes through a crisis or a personal breakdown of relationships or illness or whatever, they become very vulnerable and very much, if they don't pay attention, entrenched in their own deludedness of what they can do and how much they can manage. And if you go through a life transition, you can be enlightened as much as you want. There will be periods of time where you're vulnerable to all kinds of fallibilities. And that's what you have to look out for, especially as a teacher. Students in that situation tend to kind of give up their power. They're just like, I'm in crisis. You help me. You have all the answers. And here I am. So you take over. And that's the reverse process on part of the student, that the student has to empower themselves in order to come out of that situation. And that's when the teacher is not necessary really anymore. But it's really about that. The keyword is crisis and particular vulnerability, and the awareness on part of the teachers that, the Buddha promised the end of suffering. So whenever somebody comes to them, they're suffering. And when we're suffering or just in a bad place, all bets are off. You really can't assume that people will have all their adult capacities that they usually might have, but they don't. They might regress all the way back to, being helpless children, and that's really important to be aware of.
I'm curious about what thoughts you might have or recommendations you might have, both to organizations that have this kind of setup with a teacher and students of some kind, or perhaps those who are thinking of joining one, what you might say to them to help them avoid harm, or maybe even harming others, those who are in a teacher position.
Well, you always want to stay humble and aware of your own humanity. I think that's the pitfall even in psychotherapy. It's like, oh, I've done this for 30 years. I know everything about the mind. I know everything about myself. I know everything about students. No, we don't. We might have good grasp of it, but from person to person or moment to moment, you can always, fall on your face and not have the right idea of what people might be going through. So you have to keep humbling yourself, knowing that everybody's human and we forget stuff, or we don't really remember what it was like when you were all the way back as a beginner, and you make assumptions that just aren't true. And the most important piece is really transparency, to try to disclose, that you are a human being. I talked to a woman once. She was a teacher of religion at a college. And she said there was the same dynamic there. You are this authority. And especially when you enter a new class, students will idealize you and they will think you have all the answers and you are this perfect person. And what she did or used to do was she went in there and started cursing and, using all kinds of inappropriate words and fuck this and fuck that, just to get them off this trip of, oh, here is this enlightened person, that's so kind and perfect, doesn't have any flaws. And it's very disappointing for people, but it sends a signal from the very beginning of what you can expect. And I think there is that desire on the part of so many spiritual teachers to appear perfect, right? And many have come a long way and have transcended. I don't really like this word because it's so overused, but for lack of a better word, we'll use it. Many have done all the work, but again, you're never finished, and you have to be honest about your humanity, because when you're not, people will see you as what you present, and then you fall on your nose at some point.
It sounds a consistent theme I'm hearing is the ensuring that one remains in touch with their humanity, whether a teacher or a participant, that one can still do the great work from the tradition on dissembling these ossified views, these solid ideas about who we are, about self, without necessarily giving away agency on one's life.
That's an interesting thought. Yeah, exactly.
Gerti, was there anything else you wanted to share with the listeners?
Yeah, the other thing that's really important is, apart from that piece of humanity, is really, at the end of the day, it's all about self-empowerment. That as students, we give away our power to the teachers or whatever authority, and we project everything we think we're lacking onto other people, and we have to bring it back to ourselves and empower ourselves, not just with all the beautiful things that we have, all the skills and all the value that we possess, but also to take responsibility for what we're doing and how silly we are sometimes, and that we tend to blame. We tend to blame our parents and our teachers and the president for good reason sometimes, but anybody who's in power, it's their fault, right? As long as we remain in that position, we are not empowered. We don't take charge of our lives, and we don't really engage fully, because you can always withdraw and sit over there in your corner and say, all these people have it wrong, as long as I am, outside of it all. And you're neither fully engaged nor fully present nor fully an adult person if you can't take responsibility and always bring it back to yourself. And that's, at the end of the day, that's the major lesson that I learned from this whole story that I went through, and that I see every day, not just in my practice, but in ordinary life, that we just like to project everything onto other people, good and bad. When something goes wrong, somebody else is to blame, and when something goes right, it's, oh, this is a great person. But it always comes back to us, and that is really the most important thing to learn. And that's what teachers can do when they start to notice somebody is on this idealizing trip or on the blaming trip or on the victim trip. Just hold up this mirror and say, you have the power to change your life, and I can't change it. You have to change it.
It's so fascinating hearing you speak about this, that these ideas of you maintain your power, you own this responsibility for caring for oneself, that all of these ideas can sound like they are in conflict with Buddhist teachings around no self, if that teaching is done unskillfully and not recognizing that there's still a you here. There is still this world that we live in, however one may want to, and appropriately at times interpret this in a more deep level. Yes, the table is still just energy. Yes, we're still constantly arising and falling away. And yet, someone slugging you in the gut or taking sexual advantage of a situation is still wrong. And those can both be held in this space of unlearning, continuing to learn about how one engages with life, whether it's a Buddhist context or in therapy or something else, that it is important to still take care.
So I'm not sure I understood. You mean two things can coexist? That the person who has a lot to offer can still have problems? Is that what you're saying?
There's that, and also that these ideas of there is no self in an ultimate sense, that's great and perhaps very helpful to one's practice and one's perspective. And there is also a you living in the world, that those don't need to be mutually exclusive concepts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know if that whole concept of no self, if I, or what I make of it at this point. There was this book somebody wrote, I forget his name, but the title was enlightenment ain't what it's cracked up to be. And that was basically the short version of what we've been talking about. You can, be a spiritual practitioner for 100 years and still have an quote unquote ego. Sometimes, and he basically says, much of spiritual practice is like a carrot on a stick, right? You're promising this enlightenment and the end of suffering and all these wonderful things because there is merit in spiritual practice, but it will never fully go away. You will still grieve and you will still hurt and all these things. So some of it is really just a big empty promise to keep us working hard, which of course does have its merits. So I don't know if you can ever get rid of ego.
Well, for those who are listening, if you'd like to find out more about Gerti and her work, I'll be putting some links on the episode page for this episode, gertischoen.net, for example, as well as the book that we've been talking about here today. Gerti, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time and giving voice to this very important topic. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your podcast.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.